I'm Linda Fleisten from the DNE Research Institute. Have you ever wondered why some animals have shorter lifespans and some animals have longer lifespans? Is it a product of evolution, or is it simply a result of random chance? Why is it that smaller animals like mice seem to have shorter lifespans while larger animals like people and elephants seem to have longer lifespans? Is an animal's lifespan possibly related to their place on the food chain? Well, I'm going to talk to you today about research that addresses this question. Researchers recently addressed this question with a study involving flies. In this study, there were two groups of flies. The control group was allowed to live until the end of their natural lifespan, while in the experimental group, a high number of flies were killed by the researchers before they had a chance to die of natural causes. Researchers hypothesized that by applying a high extrinsic mortality rate, or mortality that is due to forces outside the organism, such as being squished or eaten, would result in a higher intrinsic mortality rate. The intrinsic mortality rate is mortality due to forces within the organism, like old age. Basically, the researchers hypothesized that killing a bunch of flies would result in the flies dying sooner. Ha ha ha. I don't mean the flies they killed, I mean their offspring. They would die sooner too. Their natural lifespan would become shorter. Researchers also found that the flies in the experimental group began to reach sexual maturity earlier than the flies in the control group. Because the flies in the experimental group were subject to a high rate of extrinsic mortality, the flies which reached sexual maturity earlier had an advantage over those who reached it later, because the flies that reached it earlier had longer time to reproduce before they were killed. After 2 years of this, scientists found that the flies in the experimental group had much shorter lifespans and reached sexual maturity much earlier than the flies in the other group. These results proved that their hypotheses were correct. See, it's all about the time the animal has to reproduce. Animals which are subject to high rates of extrinsic mortality have pressure to get all their reproduction in as soon as possible, so they evolve to reach sexual maturity earlier. Animals which are not subject to high rates of extrinsic mortality do not have that pressure to get their reproduction in early because they have most of their entire life to reproduce. As a result, animals who are not subject to high rates of extrinsic mortality have selection for longer lifespans because the animals with longer lifespans have more time to reproduce. And animals with shorter lifespans end up having less time to reproduce and thus less chance. The results of this study also suggest that there may possibly be a link between the age of sexual maturity and the lifespan. If they were not linked, you would not expect there to be such a strong effect on the lifespan of the flies in the experimental group. You might expect that there would not be selection against a shorter lifespan because most of the flies have a short lifespan anyway, but you wouldn't expect there to be selection for it. So you might expect a group of flies where some of the flies lived a long time and some of them did not. However, in the experiment, the flies ended up all having a short lifespan. This suggests that it is linked to sexual maturity because the selection for age of sexual maturity is much stronger than the selection for lifespan alone. Early sexual maturity is selected for in this scenario, and late sexual maturity is selected against in this scenario. You can see how there are a lot stronger forces acting on the age of sexual maturity than there are on the lifespan alone. In another study, researchers found that the age of sexual maturity and the lifespan of mice were linked. They also found that both were related to a particular growth hormone. Animals which had lower levels of that growth hormone reached sexual maturity later and died older. Animals with higher levels of that growth hormone reached sexual maturity earlier and died younger. They were also able to pinpoint the gene which regulated the amount of this growth hormone. The fact that lifespan and age of sexual maturity have been scientifically shown to be linked in mice does not necessarily mean that they are linked in flies. However, I think the results of these two studies strongly indicate that they are linked. In the real world, this would mean that an animal near the bottom of the food chain who is subject to a high rate of extrinsic mortality because of predation from another animal would evolve a shorter lifespan and also reach sexual maturity earlier in order to counteract the effects of dying young. Whereas animals who do not face a lot of predation have the benefit of their entire life after they reach sexual maturity to reproduce, it is not necessary for them to reach sexual maturity as early as possible. Therefore, these animals end up living longer. Well, I hope you enjoyed our discussion today. Come back tomorrow for more.